The meeting had been scheduled for a Tuesday evening, the kind that stretched between daylight and dusk, when the sky still carried a trace of warmth, but the streetlights had already begun to hum faintly. The community hall was filled long before the start time, chairs arranged in neat rows, the air thick with anticipation and quiet judgment. This was not just another neighborhood gathering. This was the night they had finalized what they had already whispered about for weeks. He arrived early, as he always did. He had a habit of showing up before others, not out of eagerness but principle. His father used to tell him punctuality is a sign of respect, even when others don't deserve it. He carried that belief like armor. But tonight that armor felt heavier than usual. He knew this wasn't going to be a discussion. It was going to be a verdict disguised as dialogue. The chairperson sat at the front, papers neatly stacked, expressions set in practiced neutrality. To anyone passing by, it might have looked like a civil exchange among concerned residents. But beneath the polite greetings and forced smiles, something meaner was brewing. You could feel it in the way conversations stopped when he walked in, the way eyes slid past him as though acknowledging him might make them uncomfortable. He took a seat near the back, close enough to hear but far enough to observe. Around him, clusters of neighbors murmured, some sympathetic, most indifferent. The agenda had been printed and distributed, its language sterile and formal. Item 3, discussion on property standards and community compliance. It was their way of sanitizing cruelty with bureaucracy. When the meeting began, the chairperson's voice filled the room with that same blend of authority and pretense. They spoke of community harmony, aesthetic standards, and preserving neighborhood value. Each phrase was carefully chosen to sound noble, yet every word was a weapon aimed at him. The rhetoric was smooth, the delivery confident, but the intent was unmistakable. He listened quietly, fingers tapping the armrest in a slow, steady rhythm. When the floor opened for comments, one by one the others spoke, not about him directly, of course, but about issues that must be addressed. Someone mentioned overgrown hedges, another hinted at non-conforming property conditions. The accusations floated through the air, vague enough to be deniable but pointed enough to sting. He knew what was happening. They weren't talking about grass or paint, they were talking about him. About the man who didn't always attend their social gatherings, who didn't display the same manicured conformity they prized. In their eyes, his independence was an affront to their order, and tonight they wanted to make an example of him. When it was finally his turn to speak, the room grew quieter than it had all evening. He stood slowly, not in anger, but in resolve. His voice was steady, calm. "If there are concerns about my property," he began, "I'm here to address them directly. But I'll remind everyone, I've met every regulation, paid every due, and maintained this home with care. There's nothing non-compliant about me." The chairperson shifted in their seat, offering a tight smile that didn't reach the eyes. "We appreciate your comments," they said, "but this isn't personal. We're simply ensuring consistency across the community." He looked around the room, at the faces that refused to meet his gaze, at the people who'd shared holiday dinners and backyard tools now pretending not to know him. "Consistency," he repeated softly. "Funny how it always seems to mean conformity." The silence that followed was uncomfortable, but not long-lived. The chairperson moved quickly to the next phase. "A motion has been raised to review compliance and consider appropriate action," they declared. A few hands lifted almost immediately, hesitant but complicit. It was a vote, a public ritual of exclusion disguised as procedure. In that instant something shifted inside him. He realized this was no longer about lawns or fences. It was about power, the small, intoxicating kind that thrives on collective judgment, and once it starts, it rarely stops. He had seen this before in other places, other forms. A crowd will always find justification for cruelty when it's dressed in policy. He didn't argue further. Words would do little in a room already convinced of its righteousness. Instead, he let them finish their performance, noting every phrase, every motion, every vote. There would come a time to speak again, on his terms, with evidence that would silence their self-importance. But not tonight. When the meeting adjourned, he walked out without looking back. The sound of folding chairs and low chatter trailed behind him. The air outside was cooler now, sharper. He drew in a deep breath, feeling both the sting of betrayal and the strange calm of foresight. They had gone too far, and soon they would know it. The neighborhood committee had mistaken authority for justice, mistook votes for truth. But truth, unlike collective opinion, didn't need validation. It simply waited, patient and immovable, until it was ready to reveal itself. Defiance in the face of injustice. That night, as he sat alone in his living room, the weight of the meeting lingered in the silence. The sound of voices still echoed faintly in his mind, the polite tones that masked malice, the rustle of papers as they made their official decision. The deed rested on the table beside him, still open, still undeniable. It was the one thing they couldn't take, no matter how many votes they held. But knowing the truth and living under the shadow of injustice were two different things. The following days were filled with subtle reminders of his new status as an outsider. Neighbors he once greeted every morning now avoided eye contact. A few even crossed the street when they saw him coming. Conversations would hush when he passed by, replaced by strained smiles and awkward silence. Yet beneath the isolation something inside him hardened, a quiet defiance that refused to yield. He had worked too long, sacrificed too much to let others rewrite his belonging. The walls of his home, the soil beneath his feet, all bore the imprint of his labor and his life. Their disapproval couldn't erase that. Each morning he continued his routine with deliberate calm. He mowed the lawn, trimmed the hedges, painted the porch railing. Every act of care became a statement. I am still here. You cannot erase me. His very presence became a form of resistance, a living contradiction to their decree. But defiance is never without cost. The more he stood firm, the more the committee escalated their efforts. Another notice arrived. This one couched in colder language, warning of further consequences for noncompliance. It was intimidation in official form. He read it once, then folded it neatly and placed it beside the deed, as though storing evidence for a trial yet to come. At night he sat by the window, watching the glow from neighboring houses. Behind those lit windows were people he had once trusted, now complicit in silence. Still, he felt no hate, only clarity. They had chosen comfort over conscience, conformity over courage. It was their weakness, not his. His phone rang one evening. It was a woman from down the street, one who had remained mostly neutral until now. I just wanted to say, she began hesitantly, what they're doing isn't right. Her voice trembled slightly, torn between empathy and fear of reprisal. But you know how people are. They don't want to be involved. He thanked her gently. It wasn't her voice he needed. It was her honesty. Even one acknowledgment of wrong was enough to remind him he wasn't entirely alone. There would always be those who saw the truth, even if they were too afraid to stand beside it. Days turned into weeks, and the tension thickened. Yet his resolve only grew stronger. He knew that defiance wasn't about shouting or fighting. It was about endurance. The true measure of resistance wasn't in how loudly one opposed injustice, but in how steadily one refused to bow to it. Then came the unannounced visit. 2 members of the committee showed up one morning, clipboards in hand, cameras around their necks. They claimed it was a routine inspection. He met them at the gate, blocking the path with quiet authority. You can take all the pictures you like, he said calmly, but you won't take another step without a warrant. They hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. The strength in his tone came from certainty, not aggression. Authority, real authority, is born from knowledge, and he knew the law better than they knew their own rules. They left shortly after, pretending it was a misunderstanding. Their confidence cracked. It was a small victory, but it felt like sunlight breaking through a storm. Word spread quickly after that encounter. Some whispered that he was lawyering up. Others said he was making trouble. He ignored it all, let them talk. Every rumor was just proof that they feared what they couldn't control. He spent that evening on his porch, the same spot where he'd watched so many sunsets with his wife. The world around him had grown quieter, but inside him something fierce and calm had taken root. He no longer sought acceptance or fairness from them. He sought only to stand his ground. Defiance, he realized, wasn't about rebellion. It was about preservation. It was the act of protecting what was rightfully yours, even when the world insists you surrender. It was choosing integrity over comfort, truth over approval, and though he stood alone, he stood on solid ground, the kind that no vote could shake and no whisper could erode. The next meeting was unlike any before it. Word had spread quickly that he was coming, and by the time he stepped into the hall, nearly every seat was filled. The same faces that had avoided him on the street now watched with a mixture of curiosity and unease. The committee sat at the front table again, shuffling papers and whispering in low tones, their confidence thinner this time. The memory of his quiet defiance still lingered in their minds, though few would admit it aloud. He carried no folder, no lawyer, no entourage, just a single envelope tucked beneath his arm. The room was warm, crowded, filled with that heavy air of self-righteousness that precedes judgment. The chairperson began, as always, with formalities and a carefully measured tone. "We're here," they said, "to finalize our previous discussion regarding property compliance." But beneath the politeness, everyone knew what this was. They were ready to end the matter once and for all. When his name was called, he rose slowly, the murmur of voices tapering into silence. Every movement he made seemed deliberate, every step toward the front a quiet challenge to the false authority gathered before him. He placed the envelope on the table without a word. The sound of it hitting the wood echoed louder than any accusation they had thrown his way. He unfolded the document with the care of a man unveiling something sacred. The light caught the embossed seal, gleaming faintly for all to see. "This," he began calmly, "is the deed to my property, signed, sealed, and recorded in full accordance with the law." He laid it flat on the table, turning it toward the committee members. The room grew utterly still. The chairperson's composure faltered first. "We will, of course, need to review this properly," they stammered, though the truth was plain. The signatures, the official seal, the registration number, every element was authentic and undeniable. A murmur rippled through the crowd as realization spread like a slow wave. He didn't raise his voice or point fingers, he simply stood there, steady and unflinching, as the weight of his truth filled the room. The same people who had dismissed him were now forced to look directly at what they had tried so hard to ignore. They could no longer twist rules or hide behind procedure. The facts stood like stone before them. One of the members leaned forward, scanning the document, searching desperately for a loophole. There was none. Another leaned back, arms crossed, suddenly fascinated by the floor. The silence deepened, growing heavier, sharper. The sound of truth settling into a room is never loud, but it changes everything. Behind him, someone whispered, "He really owns it." Another voice followed, softer but clearer, "Then they can't do anything." The whispers turned into a low hum, the crowd shifting in restless acknowledgement. The power that once rested with the committee began to dissolve, replaced by something far stronger: respect, reluctant but real. He looked around slowly, his gaze sweeping across the faces that had judged him, condemned him, erased him. And for the first time he saw something different in their expressions. Not pity, not guilt, but recognition. They knew. They had overstepped, and now the truth was laid bare for all to witness. Redemption through revelation. The aftermath of that moment rippled through the neighborhood like wind through tall grass. The very people who had once turned away now found themselves wrestling with quiet shame. Conversations changed. Those who had been quick to condemn spoke in gentler tones, their confidence fractured by the undeniable evidence of his right. Even the committee, once so sure of their control, moved differently now. They avoided confrontation, their words measured and restrained. It wasn't humility born of understanding. It was the uneasy awareness of having been exposed. The deed had not just proven ownership, it had revealed their arrogance, their misuse of power. He went about his days with the same quiet steadiness, tending his garden, repairing small things around the house. But now, when neighbors passed, they paused before walking on. Some offered polite nods, others gave hesitant greetings. It was as if the entire community was relearning how to look him in the eye. For him, redemption didn't come with their apologies. It came with the stillness that followed truth. He hadn't sought revenge or validation, only acknowledgement of what had always been his. The power of revelation didn't lie in humiliation, but in restoration. The deed had done what words never could. It had forced them to see him as he truly was, a man of quiet strength, rooted in integrity, unshaken by their doubt. A few days later, he found a letter in his mailbox. It wasn't official, just a handwritten note from one of the committee members. "We were wrong," it read. "Thank you for reminding us what fairness looks like." He read it twice, then folded it carefully and set it aside. It wasn't forgiveness, he felt. It was closure. The neighborhood began to soften after that. The fences that had seemed higher, the distances colder, slowly started to ease. Children waved again as they rode past. The air of tension that once hung heavy had begun to lift. Truth, when finally revealed, has a way of healing quietly, like sunlight breaking through morning fog. He never mentioned the meeting again, never reminded anyone of their mistake. He didn't need to. The silence that followed spoke louder than any speech could have. The community had witnessed what integrity looks like when cornered, and the image of him standing there, calm, composed, with the deed spread out before them, lingered in their minds long after the papers were filed away. Redemption, he knew, wasn't about erasing what happened. It was about revealing what was hidden, allowing truth to stand unguarded and unashamed. The moment they saw that deed, they saw themselves. And for many, that reflection was harder to face than his defiance ever was. In the days that followed, the neighborhood felt different, quieter, as though the air itself carried the weight of reflection. The committee's confidence had dissolved, replaced by hesitant courtesy and unspoken regret. People who once whispered about him now looked inward, questioning how easily they had joined the chorus of judgment. The story spread in small, awkward conversations, how a single piece of paper had undone collective pride. Every manicured lawn, every painted fence seemed to echo the same truth, that fairness isn't found in rules, but in conscience. The weight of a signature. The more they thought about it, the more that signature haunted them, the curve of ink that had carried authority greater than all their votes combined. It wasn't just a name on a document. It was the symbol of everything they had overlooked. That single signature held history, labor, love, and legitimacy. It reminded them that real power doesn't come from titles or committees. It comes from truth, sealed and undeniable in black and white. The morning after the revelation, the world outside his window seemed unusually still. Even the birds that usually perched along the fence seemed hesitant to break the quiet. It wasn't just silence. It was the uneasy calm that follows a storm, the kind that leaves everyone unsure of how to move forward. The neighborhood had changed overnight. Conversations that once brimmed with gossip now carried the weight of remorse. The people who had spoken so confidently about rules and regulations found themselves haunted by their own words. They had been wrong, and they knew it. He sat at the kitchen table, sunlight spreading across the papers that still lay neatly folded before him. The deed rested atop the pile, its crisp edges and embossed seal glinting faintly under the light. The contrast of black ink on white paper seemed almost poetic now. Justice captured in its simplest form. No grand speeches, no shouting, no angry confrontation. Just the quiet certainty of truth, documented and undeniable. It wasn't triumph, he felt, as he stared at the page. It was something deeper, something steadier. Vindication often comes with noise, with celebration, but his victory lived in the stillness of being right. The law had spoken, not through courts or lawyers, but through the very evidence he had safeguarded all along. And that evidence had spoken louder than any accusation, any rumor, any vote. Across the street, blinds shifted. A neighbor peeked out briefly, then disappeared again. The world was watching him differently now, not as an outcast or a troublemaker, but as a man who had stood his ground and forced the truth into the open. They didn't know what to say to him anymore. Words seemed inadequate against the quiet authority he now carried. The committee, once the unchallenged voice of the neighborhood, had gone silent. Their emails stopped. Their visits ceased. The same people who had delivered an eviction notice with confidence now couldn't even bring themselves to make eye contact. Power, it seemed, dissolved quickly when faced with documentation that couldn't be ignored. The signatures that had condemned him had no weight next to the single one that saved him. He thought back to the moment he had laid the deed on the table, the way the paper had seemed to still the room, the way arrogance had drained from their faces as fact replaced assumption. It had been a turning point, not just for him, but for everyone who witnessed it. Truth has a way of humbling people, especially when it arrives without drama, without anger, only with evidence. He rose from the table and stepped outside. The morning sun warmed his skin, and the scent of freshly cut grass drifted through the air. He walked to the edge of his property, his boots pressing lightly into the soil he had tended for years. This was more than land. It was legacy. Every inch of it carried the story of his persistence, of his belief that right doesn't need permission to exist. A car slowed as it passed his house. The driver, a man who had once voted against him, lifted a hesitant hand in greeting. He returned the gesture with a calm nod. There was no bitterness left, only clarity. He didn't need apologies. The truth had already done its work. The days began to flow again, slowly but surely, each one settling a little easier than the last. He noticed small changes, neighbors tending their gardens again, children laughing in the cul-de-sac, even the occasional wave from those who had once looked away. The neighborhood was learning, in its quiet, awkward way, to live with its own reflection. Justice had come not through confrontation but through revelation. The simplicity of it, the ink, the seal, the unmistakable clarity of ownership, had cut through the fog of pride and politics. It reminded everyone that sometimes the greatest power lies not in force or influence, but in patience and proof. He returned to his porch as the sun began to dip, the light stretching long and golden across his lawn. The world was quieter now, not because it feared him, but because it finally understood him. The truth didn't need to roar to be respected. It simply needed to be seen. And once seen, it could never be forgotten. Home, honor, and the last word. Twilight settled over the neighborhood like a sigh, soft and forgiving. The shadows grew longer, painting familiar shapes across the yard. He sat on the old porch swing, its gentle creak blending with the evening chorus of cicadas. The air was calm, carrying with it the faint scent of jasmine from the garden. For the first time in a long while, the quiet felt peaceful again. He looked around at the home he had fought to keep, the same weathered steps, the same door his wife once painted blue, because she said it made the house feel alive. Every detail whispered memory, and every memory reminded him of the years spent turning a house into a home. The committee had seen only property lines and appearances. They had never seen the heart that lived within these walls. As the stars began to appear, he thought about everything that had transpired, the meetings, the notices, the stares, the disbelief. What began as a campaign of exclusion had become a lesson in humility. The same people who had once questioned his right to belong were now forced to acknowledge that belonging isn't granted by others, it's claimed through truth and perseverance. There was a certain dignity in how it all ended. He hadn't needed to raise his voice or seek revenge. The truth had been his defense, and his steadiness had been his weapon. Honor, he realized, isn't proven in victory. It's preserved in restraint. The world expected him to fight fire with fire, but he had chosen silence, and silence had won. The street lights flickered on one by one, bathing the cul-de-sac in soft amber light. A few houses down, someone was laughing, the sound light and unguarded. Life was moving forward, just as it always does after the storm passes. Yet beneath the normalcy, something in the neighborhood had shifted for good. Respect had replaced ridicule. Awareness had replaced arrogance. They might never say it aloud, but they knew now what integrity looked like when tested. He glanced toward the garden, where the marigolds glowed faintly in the dusk. His wife used to call them the little suns. They had been her favorite, bright and unyielding even in the late autumn chill. He smiled softly, feeling her presence in every bloom, every breath of wind. This was what he had protected. Not just a deed, not just a structure. but the spirit of everything they had built together. A car door shut in the distance, followed by the sound of footsteps approaching. It was one of the younger neighbors, a man who had recently moved in. "Evening," the man said, hesitating a little. "I just wanted to say, I read about what happened at the meeting. I don't know the whole story, but I'm glad you stood your ground." He nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "Sometimes," he replied quietly, "you just have to let the truth speak for itself." The man nodded back, unsure of what to say, and walked away, leaving the night to settle once more. The stars were brighter now, scattered across a sky so clear it felt endless. He leaned back on the swing, letting it sway gently, the rhythmic motion as familiar as breathing. The sound of crickets rose and fell, a slow, steady hum that filled the spaces between thoughts. He didn't think of victory or loss anymore. What mattered was peace, the kind that comes when you know you've done right by yourself and by those who came before you. The deed, the struggle, the meetings. It all felt smaller now, part of a larger story about persistence, faith, and home. Home wasn't about fences or committees. It wasn't defined by votes or validation. It was where your history lived, where your heart settled, where truth had roots deep enough to outlast the noise of others. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the night air brush gently against his skin. Somewhere in the distance, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faintest echo of resolution. The world had moved on, but this place, his place, remained steadfast, unshaken, and undeniably his. Join the A1 Storyteller community, a place where every voice matters, where every story reminds us that resilience is never silent. Tap subscribe, turn on that notification bell, and become part of something bigger than a channel. Become part of a movement built on courage, conviction, and human truth. Visual cue, past thumbnails glide across the screen. Previous stories of justice, redemption, human spirit. Each image fades into the next like memory. If you believe in stories that make us feel before they make us judge, stories that defend what's right no matter how small the stage, then show your support. Like this video to amplify its message. Share it with someone who needs to remember that standing your ground still matters. And in the comments below, tell us, what moment in this story hit you hardest? Was it the silence of truth, or the weight of justice written in ink? Your words shape what we tell next. Your perspective builds this storytelling legacy. Because here, at A1 Storyteller, every story has a heart. And every heart deserves to be heard. The day began like any other. Soft morning light filtered through half-drawn curtains, coffee steamed in a chipped mug, and the faint hum of the neighborhood lawnmower filled the air. To him, this was home. Every creak in the floorboards, every faded photograph on the wall held a memory, a reminder of years spent building something that wasn't just a structure of wood and nails, but a reflection of perseverance. Yet, beneath the calm surface of that morning, a storm was waiting at his doorstep. The knock came sharp and rehearsed, the kind that doesn't expect to be ignored. Standing on the porch were 3 members of the neighborhood committee, polished, poised, and armed with self-importance. Their smiles were thin, their eyes colder than they appeared in the community meetings. One of them, the chairperson, held a single envelope in hand, stamped with the committee's emblem. It was official. It was final. It was the beginning of an unraveling he never saw coming. He took the envelope without a word, feeling its weight, light in mass but heavy in consequence. The words inside, typed neatly in bureaucratic formality, cut deeper than any insult. Notice of eviction. They had voted. They had decided. He was to vacate the property within 30 days. No explanation, no hearing, just a decision, passed under the pretense of neighborhood standards and collective agreement. The irony wasn't lost on him. These were people he'd once invited for barbecues, who'd borrowed his tools and shared fence-side conversations about weather and taxes. Now they stood unified against him, armed not with understanding, but with a ruling that stripped away his dignity under the guise of procedure. He tried to ask why, but their answers were rehearsed, a script of compliance and conformity. "It's been discussed," one said. "The committee voted unanimously," another added, avoiding his eyes. The letter wasn't just a notice. It was a declaration that he no longer belonged, that his roots could be cut simply because a handful of neighbors decided they were inconvenient. As they turned away, his gaze fell to the garden he had tended for years, the rows of marigolds, the patch of tomatoes that grew richer with each summer, the bench he had built for his late wife. Every detail carried her presence, her laughter, her touch. The thought of leaving it behind was unbearable, but as the morning sun climbed higher, his mind began to clear. He wasn't just a tenant of memory, he was the rightful owner of every inch of this land. The irony deepened when he thought of the paperwork filed years ago, the hours spent finalizing the deed, the signatures notarized and sealed. It wasn't arrogance that steadied him then, it was truth. Still, the injustice stung. Not just because of what was being taken, but because of how easily a community could turn from belonging to betrayal. He folded the notice carefully, placing it beside his mug. The coffee had gone cold, the taste of bitterness lingered, not from the drink, but from the realization that justice often needed a louder voice than decency. The rest of the day moved slowly. He didn't pack, he didn't plan, he simply sat with the truth, letting the weight of the letter press against the weight of his resolve. Somewhere beneath the anger, a spark of defiance began to flicker. He had spent his life believing that fairness was a shared value, that communities protected their own. But as the hours passed, it became clear that the system protecting everyone else had turned its back on him. What they didn't know, what they had underestimated, was that his claim wasn't built on sentiment, it was built on ownership. And ownership, unlike popularity, was written in ink that didn't fade with opinions. The unexpected eviction notice had arrived like a storm, but he wasn't about to be washed away. Somewhere deep down, he knew the truth would have its day, and when it did, that same committee would be forced to look him in the eye, not as an outcast, but as the man whose signature carried more weight than their votes ever could. Home under siege. By nightfall, the air around his house felt different, charged, almost hostile. The whispers had already begun. He could sense them, carried from porch to porch, cloaked in polite tones and veiled concern. In every cul-de-sac and driveway, someone was talking about him. The man who refused to move. The man who was making a scene. Inside, he sat by the dim glow of a single lamp, surrounded by the quiet hum of a life built through decades of labor. Every shelf, every worn piece of furniture told a story of endurance. He wasn't rich, but everything here was his, a monument to persistence. Yet now that monument was under siege, not by strangers but by those who once smiled at him across freshly trimmed lawns. The committee's decision had spread faster than wildfire. Rumors twisted into accusations, and before long the narrative changed. They said he had failed to follow guidelines, that his property value was affecting the neighborhood image. It didn't matter that none of it was true. In the court of community opinion, perception had already rendered its verdict. He noticed how quickly isolation took root. The morning greetings vanished, the friendly nods became distant glances. Even the kids who once waved from their bikes now pedaled faster past his driveway. His home, once a place of peace, now stood as a silent rebellion against conformity. The committee's influence was subtle but effective, alienation disguised as order. Still, he refused to yield. Each morning he tended his garden as he always had, pruning, watering, caring for life in a place others had abandoned in spirit. It wasn't about defiance alone, it was about dignity. A man without his home is a man without history, and he wasn't ready to be erased. He replayed the meeting in his head, the smugness of the chairperson, the polite but firm insistence that it's for the good of the community. Good for whom, he wondered, since when did collective comfort outweigh individual truth? His thoughts were interrupted by another letter slipped under the door, this one harsher, colder. A warning about non-compliance. It was clear they wanted him gone, and they were prepared to escalate. But he had something they didn't. The deed. Not a copy, not a claim, but the original legally binding document proving that the land was his. Every boundary line, every clause, every notarized signature stood in his favor. They could vote 100 times, their decision would still crumble before the law. He kept the deed in a drawer beneath the old family Bible, a symbol of both faith and truth. Some nights he'd take it out just to look at it, to remind himself that justice wasn't a favor granted by others. It was a right earned through patience and persistence. The siege wasn't only on his home, it was on his peace, his identity, his place in the world he helped build. But he wasn't afraid. The same soil they walked over had been tilled by his hands. The same neighborhood they claimed to protect had been shaped, in part, by his contributions. And one day soon, they'd remember that. The days ahead would not be easy. The pressure would mount. But when the moment came to reveal the truth, he would be ready. The committee might hold a vote, but he held the deed. The letter lay unopened on the kitchen table, its corners already curled from the countless times his fingers had brushed against it. He didn't need to read it again, every word was burned into his memory. But this time as he looked at it, he felt something different. Not anger, not sadness, but clarity. They believed they could strip him of what was his, that their votes could outweigh legal truth. They had underestimated him. Morning light crept across the table, illuminating the faint smudges of soil on his hands. He had spent most of the night awake, walking through the house that had held his laughter, his grief, his milestones. The walls seemed to whisper reassurance, quiet reminders that he wasn't alone. Every nail driven, every repair made was an act of ownership. No one could take that from him, not legally, not morally. In the corner of the living room stood a weathered oak cabinet, his father's, passed down through generations. Inside it rested documents bound by time and integrity. Among them, in a manila envelope marked simply property, lay the deed. Its paper was slightly yellowed, but the ink remained sharp, the signatures unmistakably clear. He pulled it out slowly, his hands steady. This wasn't just proof, it was his defense, his declaration. The neighborhood committee might have held their vote in confidence, but he held something far greater. Facts. Facts have no allegiance to popularity or pretense. As he unfolded the document, the embossed seal caught the light, a quiet symbol of authority that no whispered meeting could undo. He remembered the day he and his wife had signed it. She had smiled that day. Soft, hopeful, radiant. "This house," she had said, "is more than just where we live. It's where we belong." He could still hear her voice, faint but steady, echoing through the years. That memory gave him strength now. The same walls she had helped decorate, the same porch she had filled with potted flowers, were now under attack, from people who knew nothing of what this place meant. He thought of the committee again, their self-assured tones, their polished phrases. They had mistaken his quiet nature for weakness. They thought their vote was final. But a man who holds the deed holds the truth, and the truth, unlike opinion, does not bend to pressure. He tucked the document under his arm and stepped outside. The crisp morning air met him with the smell of damp earth and trimmed grass. Across the street he saw them, 2 members of the committee, chatting in low voices, pretending not to see him. He walked past without a word, his gaze steady. Let them talk. Soon conversation would give way to realization. Later that week, when the committee convened for another discussion, he arrived early. The meeting was held in the community hall, a small building that smelled faintly of floor polish and old coffee. The air buzzed with small talk, with that strange blend of civility and tension that only neighborhood politics could create. He sat quietly at the back, the envelope in his hand. When his name was mentioned, all conversation ceased. The chairperson straightened their notes, ready to reinforce the eviction vote. That was when he stood. His voice, calm but resonant, carried through the room. He didn't raise it. He didn't need to. Authority doesn't shout. It simply exists. He stepped forward, placing the envelope on the table. The sound of paper hitting wood was louder than the murmurs that followed. "This," he said evenly, "is the deed to the property you're attempting to take from me." The words settled like thunder rolling in slow motion. The chairperson's expression faltered, the secretary fumbled with their pen. For a moment, silence dominated the room. Thick, heavy, undeniable. He opened the envelope carefully and unfolded the document, laying it flat for all to see. The embossed seal glimmered faintly beneath the fluorescent lights. "I suggest," he continued, "that before you cast another vote, you familiarize yourselves with the law that governs ownership." Every signature, every date, every notarized line stood as witness. The paper didn't just prove possession, it dismantled their entire argument. They had tried to use authority to erase him. Now authority, in the purest form, stared them in the face. The murmuring resumed, softer this time, tinged with disbelief. One of the members leaned forward, scanning the page as though searching for a loophole. But there was none. Truth is whole. It doesn't fracture under scrutiny. He didn't gloat, he didn't need to. The document spoke louder than pride ever could. It wasn't just his salvation, it was their reckoning. The same system they had tried to weaponize against him now exposed their ignorance, and in that moment the power dynamics shifted entirely. For weeks they had painted him as stubborn, unreasonable, out of touch. But now their narrative dissolved before their eyes. They couldn't vote against legality, couldn't erase what was written and verified. Their collective voice, once so loud, was now just noise against the solid truth of one man's rightful claim. He stood quietly as they whispered among themselves, as the chairperson's confidence drained into discomfort. The document lay there, a silent rebuke, a symbol of what happens when arrogance collides with evidence. What began as a campaign to exile him had turned into a lesson none of them would forget. The deed didn't just change the situation, it changed everything. The power, the control, the false authority. It all unraveled in a single moment of truth. Power, pride, and paperwork. In the days that followed, the air around the neighborhood felt charged with uneasy quiet. The whispers had stopped, but the tension lingered like humidity before a storm. Everyone knew what had happened at the meeting. The story spread in fragments, some exaggerated, others humbled, but the essence remained the same. The man they tried to evict had stood his ground with nothing more than a piece of paper and the truth behind it. To outsiders it might seem like a simple matter, a property dispute resolved by proof. But within the community it was far more than that. It was a collision of power and pride, a reminder that control, no matter how neatly packaged in formal votes and official letters, could crumble before a single line of lawful ink. For the committee, the realization was bitter. They had acted with confidence, certain that procedure and unity would shield them. Yet beneath their authority lay a dangerous arrogance, the belief that paperwork served power, not the other way around. But the deed had shown otherwise. Behind closed doors, their frustration brewed. Meetings, once filled with self-assured chatter, now echoed with hesitation. The chairperson avoided his gaze whenever their paths crossed, and the rest offered tight-lipped smiles that betrayed discomfort. The balance had shifted, and though none dared to admit it aloud, they knew they had been wrong. He went about his days quietly, as he always had. He repaired the fence that bordered his property, painted the window frames, and returned to tending his garden. But now, there was something different in the way the neighbors watched him. Some avoided him out of guilt, others approached with cautious respect. They had seen what integrity looked like when challenged, and it humbled them. Power, he realized, was often an illusion, built on compliance and perception. The committee's authority had depended on people believing in their right to decide, but that belief vanished when confronted with unshakable truth. Pride, too, was a fragile thing. It could disguise insecurity, justify cruelty, even masquerade as righteousness. Yet, in the end, pride falls silent before facts that cannot be denied. Paperwork, the mundane, the overlooked, had become the great equalizer. The same sheets they had used to deliver an eviction notice were now their undoing. Each word, each line of the deed, was a testament to what happens when legality meets conscience. He didn't celebrate their embarrassment. He simply carried on. The victory wasn't about revenge, it was about restoration. The deed had restored not only his rights, but his peace, his standing, his quiet dignity. It had shown that truth doesn't need to roar to be heard. Sometimes it just needs to be held up to the light. In the evenings, when the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across his lawn, He would sit on the porch with the document safely tucked away again, knowing that the real power never rested in committees or votes. It rested in the courage to stand firm when others choose convenience over what's right. The neighborhood, once certain of its order, now carried an unspoken awareness. Authority means nothing without justice, and paperwork, when honest, can topple even the proudest display of control.